This module is going to cover both ethics of care and virtue ethics, and there's some overlap between the two of them, which is why I thought they would work well to be handled together. Ethics of care deals with a foundation of relationships with all sorts of stakeholders. And when we have an important relationship with a stakeholder, how we should make sure that they are front and center in our points of view and in the way we take care of them. And then virtue ethics is from Aristotle's philosophy work. And Aristotle argues that we should strive to be virtuous. But how we define what is virtuous is very context specific. And so we'll get into understanding this in a little bit. The next theory we'll talk about is ethic of care. And ethic of care is really about building valuable relationships with everybody. And this is a big issue in marketing. It's a very big issue in human resource management. And when we think about this in terms of stakeholder analysis, as we talked about in chapter 1, the ethic of care is about making sure we're building good relationships with all of our stakeholders. And in doing that, of course, we don't want to, quote unquote, screw over any of our stakeholders on a consistent basis. And there's a big difference between saying no to a stakeholder and screwing them over. And what I mean by the difference is when I am saying no to someone, it doesn't mean I'm going to say no every time. It means maybe in this circumstance I have to say no to them. But when we're screwing somebody over, that means we're consistently and regularly ignoring their needs and taking advantage of them. And that then devalues the relationship we have with them so that we end up in the end not being able to have a good relationship with those candidates. So, with those stakeholders. So it is important for us to recognize when we are considering ethics and ethical decision making, it's an ethic of care and how we interact with each other. If you recall, we talked about Carol Gilligan's work about how women and men tend to have different moral development in the way they think about what is moral or ethical. And this is a great example of a theory that really gets at not just this notion that everything has to be rational and logical in the approach to things, but more so that it is highlighting and valuing the way women make ethical decisions, which is about relationship building and how important that is for long-term business relationships. So the textbook covers Malden Mills and what happened in Malden Mills, and here's a great example of their ethic of care. They didn't shut down the factory. They didn't move operations to another country, which many companies do because they don't have loyalty to the people who have been working for them. And they continued to pay their employees while the factory was being rebuilt. I would also point out to you, after 9/11, there was an organization called Cantor Fitzgerald, which was unfortunately on one of the floors that were directly hit by the first airplane, I think, that hit the World Trade Center towers. If not the first, it certainly was the second one. And even though the company was not functioning and even though so many of their people died, they continued to pay salaries for those employees who had died and their families were still depending on that income. They made sure that the company was still making payments even though they weren't operational. So again, this notion that we should care about people as human beings, as part of our larger communal family, is really important. Now, people like Milton Friedman would argue, well, we don't owe that. We don't owe people that. We only owe shareholders, money. And there's many good arguments for doing that. But at the same time, we also recognize when we treat people like they matter to us, that the relationship that we're building with them matters. We're making an investment in a long-term relationship, not just a short-term relationship. So I think it's very important that we consider not just profitability and shareholder values, but also the values for how we value all of our stakeholders in that process. So Malden Mills, Cantor Fitzgerald, these are all great examples of companies that engage in what we call an ethic of care. There are, of course, just like all the other theories, criticisms of the ethic of care. Number one, that it reflects unjust favoritism. And I understand that, because if we are taking care of people in a deeper way, it may feel like it is favoritism, that we are treating people differently and not consistently. So it could reek of favoritism. And also that it's demanding and can lead to burnout. And I would agree with that to some extent as well, because again, if we are exporting our energy to love and support others and to exhibit care for them, it's certainly not unreasonable to expect that as we are trying to care for others, that ultimately it could lead to burnout on our part. And so I would highly recommend the focus that we would take is much more about balance, right? That it's not just all ethic of care, that maybe what we would want to do is make sure that we are taking care of people, but not in such a way that it burns us out. I think there's a little bit of truth in all of these theories that we should try to put together to develop a plan of attack about how we handle people and how we handle ethical and moral decision making. So this sort of gets at some of my concerns, of course, as well, right? How do we make sure that we are balancing all that needs to be done for our clients and ensuring that they are being taken care of the best way possible? And that means we have to consider not just one ethical theory, but multiple ethical theories in the process. And that transitions us into this next section, which is exactly what I was arguing, how important it is for us to integrate all the ethical theories, all the ethical norms of decision making, that we should integrate the utility analysis, utilitarianism, the rights and duties analysis, universalism, the justice lens from Rawls, and the caring of the ethics of caring, or the caring ethics, and how important it is for all four of those to be worked together. Each of them have very distinctive standards. So can and should we be making decisions integrating all four of these? That we want to make sure solutions maximize benefits and minimize harm, respect the moral rights for all, promote a just distribution of benefits and burdens, and exhibit appropriate care for all of our stakeholders. I think we can come up with solutions like this. And the challenge is, of course, that a lot of people don't want to put the effort into it. And this is what the purpose of this class is to encourage you to recognize how important it is to put in the effort to analyze and make sure these decisions are addressing these four ethical theories and norms about the way we want to approach things. This is just a graphic from the textbook that sort of highlights what that process would look like. We start with those four different comparable, complementary moral standards: the social utility, the moral rights, the distributive justice issues of Rawls, and then the exercising care for our stakeholders. We then gather that factual information concerning the policies, institution, or behaviors under consideration, and then ultimately we make our moral judgment. As you engage in your discussion boards, I'm going to have you use this process to make decisions together as a group. There are 3 discussion boards, so you're going to have to start coordinating with individuals in the class. You can work virtually, that's not a problem, but it is important that we practice this process of ethical decision making in that manner. So wrapping that up about how we integrate all of those different theories, they do relate to each other in many ways. And so our moral standards need to include all 4 elements: net utility, respect for everybody's individualist rights, good just distribution of benefits and burdens, and caring for those in concrete relations to us. So all 4 of those should be considered in the process. Some might get more weight than another, but in all of them, they should be part of that discussion, part of that decision-making process. The fifth theory out there that I like to include in this whole process is about virtue ethics and how we consider the virtues of the decision maker, and how our communities determine what is considered to be moral or ethical. So Aristotle came up with this notion of virtue ethics because he believes that we are obligated to engage in moral virtues that is this reasonable point between extremes. So a balanced point. And I think that this works really nicely in alignment with the idea of integrating all four of those other theories. And it complements that by saying the actors should engage with virtue, and to be the role model that they think they should be. So the way this basically works is recognizing that when a situation happens, what would be the virtuous response and what would be the vice, what would be the two extremes. Too much excess or not enough, where we're deficient, means that we need to find the virtuous point in the middle. Now, the challenge with virtue ethics is that it's very contextual. For example, it's dependent on the local community. It's dependent on the context. And I remember reading this article a number of years ago when they were talking about building the dorms for people for the Olympic Games. I know this is kind of a weird analogy, but it'll make sense when I explain it. When they are deciding on food service for the athletes, they have to accommodate diets all along the spectrum. Every different athlete adheres to a different diet, a different way of thinking about things. And for example, they talked about the difference between the large heavyweight wrestlers or heavyweight boxers and what they will eat, and how and what would be considered appropriate for them as compared to gymnasts or ice skaters who have a very different type of diet and in fact may not eat the same way and certainly do not eat the same way as boxers or wrestlers do. And what would be considered overeating for a gymnast would be completely appropriate for a boxer or a wrestler. So it is very contextual. So what is considered to be a virtue or a vice, or what is considered to be excessive at either of the extremes, is going to differ when you're thinking about a gymnast versus a wrestler. So a wrestler, it might be considered a vice to not eat enough, whereas for a gymnast, what a wrestler eats would be considered the vice. It's too much for them. And I want you to think about that in the context of the issue of what is considered to be virtuous or the ethical norm that we want to engage in. And we might say, well, that seems like that would be virtuous, but virtuous to whom and under what situation would it be virtuous? So when we're thinking about virtue ethics, it helps us to consider the integration of those four lenses, the utility, the rights, the justice, and the caring ethics, and how they are really dependent on context, and what is appropriate in one context may not be appropriate in another. This is not quite overlap with relativism, because this really does try to find what would be an appropriate approach to things. But nonetheless, it's something to consider that it does border on this notion of what is considered to be relativistic, because it has to take into account what the community says. But how it differs is that virtue ethics is truly trying to find what is the right thing to do. That is part of its quest, if you will. And so when we're evaluating ethical actors, we consider, right, what kind of behaviors did they engage in given the circumstances, and would it be considered greedy, or would it be considered to be completely appropriate? And I like the examples they gave from Quest Communications about some of the moral vices that we saw in Quest, We saw issues of greed. We saw issues of that culture of fear, and how important it is for us to consider the behaviors of the individual relative to what the appropriate norms are for behaviors in an industry, in a community, in a country, et cetera, et cetera. Virtue ethics are very dependent on context, and so we have to take that into account. So the golden mean, Aristotle talks about that reasonable space, the virtuous space in between the two extremes of either deficiency or excess. In the next slide, we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. So here is a great summary of how the golden mean works. The third column over where it says virtuous mean of emotion or action is our golden mean. That's what we want to see in terms of behaviors. Again, how we define it is going to depend on context to context. But when we think about the emotion of fear, right, and what is the virtuous response to fear? It should be courage. We don't want it to be the deficient position, which is cowardliness, and like the cowardly lion, right, in the Wizard of Oz. And we don't want it to be the other extreme of recklessness. Like, because I am in a place of fear, I am going to be completely reckless because I'm going to do everything I can to erase my fear. Courage is about this temperance between being cowardly and being reckless. It's that middle ground, if you will. For pleasure, right? Self-deprivation, that doesn't work. Self-indulgent, that doesn't work. But that middle ground of temperance, recognizing when it's appropriate to indulge, the level at which we should indulge in pleasure, and when we need to say no. Because obviously self-indulgence can create a lot of problems for people, but so does deprivation, this notion that we don't deserve pleasure or comfort or happiness, right? So each one of these items is dealing with that golden mean, which is the third column over, and the excessive behavior or emotion related to the emotion, or the deficiency of it, one way or the other. And our goal is to try to find where the virtue mean is, where that golden mean is for our behaviors, which, as I said, would be different from place to place. So when we talk about hunger, right? Gluttony for the wrestler is different than gluttony for the gymnast. For the gymnast, eating more than maybe 1,000 calories a day would be considered gluttonous, versus for the wrestler, 2,000 or 3,000 calories a day would be completely appropriate because their muscle mass is burning calories in a different way, or their body is burning calories in a different way because of their muscle mass. Is probably the more appropriate way of thinking about that. So our goal is to figure out where that virtuous mean is and consider it in the context of the situation that we're dealing with.